Okay. Shall we start, or we're gonna wait for maybe 1 minute?
Yeah. Have we discussed the order already?
Yeah, I will talk about that a little bit. Yeah. Okay, maybe let's get started. So welcome everyone to this conversation on George Steinmetz's new book, the Colonial Origins of Modern Social Thought, French Sociology and the Oversea Empire. It's events organized by Theory, History, and Society, 时间社 in Chinese. It's a scholarly collective dedicated to cross-national intellectual exchange in historical social science and social theory. And my name is Xiaohong Xu. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Michigan, and also a co-founder of Theory, History, and Society Scholarly Collective. And today we're very honored to have George Steinmetz to share his new book with us. And we have initially 4 actually, but now we only have 3 commentators on the book that we really look forward to their comments and the exchange. I want to first start by saying that unfortunately Professor Emmanuelle Saada could not be here today for some family emergency. She actually contacted me a couple of days ago, and also yesterday in the middle of a family emergency in Paris, and now she cannot make it. And so those of you who have already have a copy of a book, you know that she's one of the people who have written a blurb on it, so she's familiar with the book, and she has also scholarship is on French Empire and French imperialism. So she actually has a very deep knowledge about the context and also the text that the book analyzes. And so we only hope that we can, have the maybe another chance in the future to hear her thoughts on the book. And I think the order of the conversation today is that we're going to have, since Professor Saada will not be here, so we'll have, Professor George Steinmetz to start with 20 to 30 minutes presentation, and then followed by discussion comments from each of our panelists for 10 minutes. So we're going to have 30 minutes from the discussants, and then we'll have George respond to the comments, and then after that we open up the floor to questions from the audience, and we will end at 12 p.m. sharp Eastern time. So let me introduce the panelists today first. And the first of all, the book author is George Steinmetz, and Steinmetz is the Charles Tilly Collegiate Professor of Sociology in the Department of Sociology at the University of Michigan, and a corresponding member of the Centre Sociology Européen, the Center of European Sociology in Paris. And he's a social theorist and a historic sociologist of states, empires, and social science. He's currently working on 2 main projects. The first is project on the emergence of sociology in the former British and the French overseas colonies between the 30s and the 60s. And this is the part of the project. He has a trilogy, and this is the first book from the trilogy. And the second is a reconstruction of sociology as historical social analysis. I think he mentioned that part of that agenda in the book as well. And he also has, many of you know, published on German welfare state in the 19th century, and the German empires in Southwest Africa, Samoa, and Qingdao. And he also has added, 5 books on epistemology of human science and political cultural theory that are very influential. So we'll have 3 discussions today, and so the order will go with Mathieu Desan first, whose research also is very sort of touches upon some of the aspects that the book touch on. So Mathieu Desan is a assistant professor of sociology at the University of Colorado Boulder, and he's a historical sociologist with a substantive interest in social theory, political sociology, cultural sociology, and critical sociology, Marxism, fascism, and the history of socialist thought. He has published on these and other topics in comparative studies in society and history, sociological theory, history of human sciences, and thesis 11. He's currently working on a manuscript about the practical logic of political conversion, with a special focus on the case of French neo-socialists who became ideologically committed Nazi collaborators during World War II. So it's a kind of historical irony. Next, we will have Professor Ho-Fung to comment on the book. Ho-Fung is Henry M. and Elizabeth P. Wiesenfeld Professor in Political Economy at the Sociology Department and the Paul H. Nitz School of Advanced International Studies of the Johns Hopkins University. His scholarly interests includes global political economy, protest, nation-state formation, social theory, and Eastern Asian development. He has published 4 monographs on political economy and protest in China and Hong Kong, and the relationship between China and global capitalism led by the US. He's writing a book on Orientalism, China in Western social thoughts, entitled China Fantasy, China Fear, Orientalism and Capitalism from Pax Mongolica to Pax Americana. So I think he will be able to provide a comparative perspective on these on the issues that George Steinmetz writes on in the book. And then we'll have Nicholas Wilson. Nick Wilson is an associate professor of sociology at Stony Brook University. Wilson's research focuses on the historical sociology of empires, colonization through the case of English East Indian trading companies' presence in South Asia. In addition, he studies the methodology of interdisciplinary research, transformations in historical category of corruption, the sociology of knowledge and morality, physical sociology, and philosophy of social science. As we just saw, he just published his book, Modernity, Corruption, Empire, and Morality in the Making of British India. And he has written about the entanglement of British social thought and British colonialism in India. So he is also able to provide a comparative perspective from the British angle. With all that, I want to give the floor to George Steinmetz to give a presentation on the book.
Okay, thank you very much, Ho-Fung, and thanks to all of you for agreeing to discuss the book. Given that you all have all kinds of interesting critical things to ask me, I thought I'd try to do what Ho-Fung asked me to do, which is to summarize the book. And it's a kind of a heterogeneous ensemble, so it takes a bit of doing to figure out what it's exactly doing, and I'll try to tell you what I think it's doing. So I'll start with that. And the book presents a kind of a revisionist history of French social thought in the 20th century. And it argues that colonial research in and on colonies and empires, represented a very crucial central part of the emerging academic discipline of sociology between the late 1930s and the mid 1960s. The effects of the repression of the memory of this colonial formation, this foundational moment, I think can be felt throughout French sociology and all sociologies and social sciences across the world. Many of our current categories, including the categories that I myself use in the book, originated in, or at least partially in, colonial contexts. Now, what I argue is that this doesn't mean that we need to purge them and repress them once again, as already happened after the mid-1960s, but instead that we should examine them in very close detail, examining their intellectual emergence and pay attention to both their contexts and their contents. I argue that historical socioanalysis or sociology of social science should pay attention to four key components when analyzing intellectual production. So in a way, this is a program for the history of intellectuals as well as the sociology of knowledge. These are, first of all, context, secondly, field, thirdly, author, and fourth, text. And in most of the existing approaches to intellectual history, there's an emphasis on one or the other of these, sometimes explicitly to the exclusion of others. I argue that all of them need to be brought together. First, that social fields and social spaces need to be situated within overarching contexts, which are somewhat removed from the immediate point of intellectual production. These broad, sometimes epoch-encompassing contexts may be patterned by styles of thought, as Karl Mannheim argued in his original work on the sociology of knowledge, by dominant discourses, as certain discourse theorists and neo-Marxists have argued, by modes of societal regulation, by political, economic, and social forces that stamp an entire epoch. Social contexts provide a framework within which all social fields exist. This is not to say, however, that we need to look for some general social theory of context. Instead, I argue here and in some of my other work that what we should look for are concepts linked to particular historical periods and spaces, such as, for example, developmental colonialism, which is the form of colonialism used by Europeans in their empires after World War II, or late colonialism, or the early Cold War versus the middle Cold War, as some of the research on Cold War has used, or fascism versus Nazism, as opposed to maybe a generic category of fascism, Atlantic Fordism, as opposed to Fordism per se, since Fordism differed in the Soviet Union and in Western Europe and in the United States, etc. These are examples of epoch-spanning context. As for fields, I guess I'm arguing that they can never be assumed to be spatially identical to the nation state, but that they often have a smaller or larger geospatial and geopolitical footprint. The social researcher has to determine the exact geo-coordinates of the field that they're studying in order to understand the circulation of ideas, objects, and actors within that field and between that field and other fields and other contexts. Turning to the third category, the individual, a small category, I argue that we can begin with Bourdieu's theory of habitus and practice, but this needs to be supplemented and reconstructed if we want to really make sense in a useful way of the way the human individual and the psyche intersects with intellectual production or affects intellectual production. And this is why I call the approach socioanalytic. Now, I'm not arguing that I have a full-fledged socioanalytic theory, but this is a kind of a desideratum for working in this area. So I certainly don't claim to be a psychoanalyst, for example, or someone who has full understanding of this, but I'm willing to play around with this and talk about this. And I have a few examples in the book where I think it does shed some light on the actual intellectual production of these sociologists. Finally, I turn to the texts themselves. And these are the ultimate focus of intellectual history the sociology of intellectuals, and the sociology of social science. Ultimately, this is why we're interested in intellectual history. We live in a world of texts, and social science, like other fields of cultural production, is not just a field of actors and institutions, but a field of works. And these works exist in relation to one another in a field-like or relational manner as well. These intertextual and transtextual relations among works are what, for example, the Cambridge School of Intellectual History calls context. So there's an example of reducing intellectual history, I guess, to one particular line of analysis. Here they are just, in my work at least, I'm trying to make them figure as one kind of context, but a crucial one. What's also needed, I argue, is an approach to social scientific texts themselves that takes advantage of formal methods, theories, and concepts that have been developed by specialists in textual analysis. Rather than clinging to the idea that one discipline can do everything, we need to be open to the idea that other disciplines have really specialized for over a century in these kinds of questions about the formal analysis of texts, for example. So taken together, to summarize, attention to context, field, author, and text, I think can define a somewhat more adequate socioanalysis of knowledge and science. Now, in some parts of the book, I call this neo-Bourdieusian, but as Chaz Kamek pointed out in his analysis of my book, it really seems like what I'm doing, and I think this is correct, is more of an amalgam between neo-Bourdieusian field theory and a sociology of knowledge that takes seriously both context at these higher levels and takes seriously the more fine-grained analysis of texts themselves. This is not to say that none of the Bourdieusians have done that. Of course they have, but to foreground this. And in addition to the relation between fields and concepts, I would bring in those other factors. Now, what about the question of research design? How is this book sort of structured when we, give advice to graduate students about how to design a dissertation, for example, or even someone who's trying to publish in the American Sociological Review? We often talk about, well, what's the research design? So I think there is a design feature here that it might be, it was interesting for me to try to figure out what my design was after I wrote the book. So I'll pretend like I had it in mind all along and tell you what it was. I focus on, first of all, mid-20th century France, rather than, say, the era of high imperialism of the late 19th century or the 1920s, when European colonial empires reached their greatest dimensions and were blanketed by anthropological research. Sociology remained in this period a small, uncertain discipline in Europe between the wars and in all of the colonizing countries. It was barely emerging. So this led me to focus on a slightly later period because I really wanted to deal with sociology per se. Professional colonial sociology reached its apex between the late 1930s and the mid-1960s. What this means is not only that the sociologists in the British, Belgian, French, and now it turns out the Portuguese as well fields were very invested in researching, in doing field research in colonial situations, but also analyzing colonies and empires in this period. This also means that I'm focusing on, in the French case, as, for example, Mathieu Desan knows well from his work and writes about the late Third Republic, Vichy France, Nazi-occupied France, the territories occupied by the Free French during World War II, the Fourth Republic, which is pretty much the center of gravity of my work, the period from 1944 to 1958, and the early Fifth Republic. So this is an enormous span of political regimes. I also, although it's all concentrated in a very sort of short historical period, but this is deliberate because this maps onto the kind of apex of colonial sociology, which is what determines this feature of the book's design. Another reason for concentrating on the period between the late 30s and the end of decolonization is the greater relevance of that work to our own current concerns. After all, to take the most obvious example, Pierre Bourdieu is still the most cited sociologist worldwide today, and his concepts emerged in late colonial Algeria. The intensity of that experience, combined with Bourdieu's own particular educational background and the field dynamics in which he was involved in scientific fields, allowed him to kind of convert the colonial situation into a world-changing scientific theory. Why focus on France? After all, I mean, as Ho-Fung told you, I'm working simultaneously on the British and the French, and I also have a brief section on the Belgian cases here, but I decided to foreground the French in the first volume and to cut out the British case for the next volume, because I think it's the most dramatic example of a social scientific discipline that was stamped indelibly by colonialism. The prosopography of the entire field of sociologists in France that I had to create for this, which is another design feature, finds that around half of them worked on or in colonial settings between the late 30s and the mid 60s. They worked in an empire-wide disciplinary field that encompassed universities, research organizations, conferences, journals edited overseas in the colonies and in the metropoles, etc. Sociologists who were born as French citizens moved with relative ease throughout this global imperial space, as did the Belgian Francophone sociologists. But the international movement of sociologists born as colonized subjects was more constrained, even after decolonization, and their movements were usually bilateral between their home country in France and France in their home country, rather than ranging freely across the entire colonial empire. How can we determine who belonged to a given academic field in the past? This is another sort of design/methodological question. In other words, who were the sociologists? This is not so obvious, since disciplinary boundaries were extremely fluid at the time, and indeed still are more fluid in France than in the United States. Bourdieu's field theory offers, I think, invaluable methodological guidance here. The most fundamental rule of thumb in his field theory would be that membership in any specialized universe, like academic sociology, encompasses anyone and everyone who was recognized at the time as a member of that field by other contemporary participants in that field. Therefore, a scientific and academic discipline can best be reconstructed by going back to its genesis moment, starting with its nomothetes, the people who found the field, the nomos, and then following them forward in time, tracking the evolution of structural positions, axes of polarization, inductions of outsiders into the field, rejections of people they don't think are sociologists out of the field, and so on. Scientific canons are constantly being revised in all intellectual disciplines, and scientific membership is also turbulent. The only secure way to determine the population of a disciplinary field at a given moment, then, is to reconstruct the judgments of all other members of the field at that time. It's a methodological error, I argue, to adopt the structuring principle of intra-scientific struggle as one's own classificatory principle. This is a central criterion in my book, because many of the people that I'm analyzing and discussing are and would be nowadays spontaneously labeled as anthropologists for the simple fact they worked on African or other non-European colonized populations. But as the book tries to argue, this was really not the case in the judgments of contemporaries, and the emergence of sociology out of a mixture of anthropology and sociology is actually a key part of the narrative. The book's argument in chapter 2 presents colonial sociology in the late Third Republican wartime period and post-war France in more detail. And I use the phrase colonial sociology and sociology of colonialism kind of interchangeably, partially because contemporaries use the phrase colonial sociologist to describe themselves, but then explicitly tried to move away from that as colonialism became denigrated and was explicitly euphemized by educated populations and colonial administrators in France for euphemisms such as the French Union or the French Community, which were the two main terms used to describe the empire after World War II. I use it partially, therefore, because it retains the sting of colonialism without necessarily implying that a colonial sociologist was a colonialist sociologist. And indeed, that's not the case at all. It turns out the vast majority, especially after World War II, were anti-colonial sociologists working in colonial situations. The rest of the book follows and develops this approach that I've described. I won't go over the chapters, but just briefly to tell you how it's structured. The first section discusses the reoccupation of the French Empire after World War II. This is something that happened in the British Empire as well, a huge influx of experts and of money and of military from the metropoles into the remaining colonies, particularly in Africa, where the colonial empires were recentered after the loss of most of the East Asian and Southeast Asian colonies. And this reoccupation involved experts that included social scientists and sociologists. The reason for this, as chapter 4 argues, is that the dominant policy of colonial offices, both in Britain and in France, as well as Belgium and Portugal, was a developmentalist policy. This is well known from the work of historian Fred Cooper, but it receives total confirmation here in the kind of social scientific aspects of that project, which is that sociologists who nonetheless, even in France, were considered to be experts in welfare policies, in things like helping with the uprooting and resettlement of colonial populations, as in Algeria during the Algerian Revolutionary War, when sociology was a key part of the uprooting that Bourdieu himself and Abdelmalek Sayad wrote about at the time. Sociologists were known to some amongst themselves, some of them referred to themselves as resettlement sociologists, and they had a specialization in kind of empirical research on things like welfare, personal budgets, demography, migration, the kinds of things that were intrinsic to the developmentalist moment. The next chapter looks at higher education and the expansion of French higher education across the empire, as well as research institutes. And then in the next part of the book, I examine intellectual contexts. Intellectual contexts included all of the disciplines surrounding sociology with which it had intensive interaction and from which it partially emerged: law, economics, psychology, history, statistics, demography, and most importantly, anthropology. So I spent 2 whole chapters kind of reconstructing the colonial engagements of those disciplines in the same period in French, in the Francophone world, as well as their intersections with sociologists. Chapter 8 then looks at sociology itself as an intellectual context in the pre-war period, in the interwar period between World War I and II, and looks at how that provided a kind of a springboard with a set of unresolved theoretical questions that then were worked through by some of these colonial specialists in the post-war period, so that the Durkheimian and the post-Durkheimian legacy doesn't die out, but appears again in this aspect of French sociology that's been written out of most of the historiography of French post-war sociology, shines a new light on the afterlives of Durkheimian sociology, in fact, interestingly. Part 4 then does a kind of, descends to the level of field per se, the field of sociology, and first engages in a kind of a brief field analysis, a prosopography-based field analysis of the relations between the colonial specialists and the metrocentric specialists in French sociology after World War II. And I guess the main takeaway here is first how large a subfield colonial sociology was, that it had a subfield-like quality with its journals, conferences, cross-references, intertextual relations among their texts, and that they were located more or less at the same level of symbolic capital as the metrocentric experts and field founders that are perhaps more familiar from the historiography. At the same time, of course, they were distributed across the field, and many of them were deeply dominated. And chapter 10 deals with the dominated figures within French sociology, particularly three categories. The first are these disadvantaged groups who had trouble breaking into the discipline even at all or into the core of the discipline, were the so-called, and this is the term at the time, not my term, bush sociologists, the people who spent their entire career in remote overseas settings. Secondly, the colonial officials who tried to convert themselves into academics, which was a common path both in the British and the French cases, who had increasing problems of recognition after World War II as colonialism became less and less legitimate among members of academic scientific disciplines, with major intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre and Frantz Fanon stepping out against colonialism and making it even more toxic as a result. Then it turns to the so-called colonized or the indigenous sociologists, the people who were born as subjects, not citizens, and looks at a series of them and looks at the strategies that they could use to try and break into the field. And what I find especially important here is, first of all, something that I think we would probably expect, which is the incredible difficulties they faced. Secondly, the assistance that some of them received, like Abdelmalek Sayad, from members of the field like Pierre Bourdieu. And thirdly, and I think this is the least obvious, but shows the usefulness of doing a close textual and a field analysis and combining the two, is the textual symptoms of their dominated status. So three of the figures I looked at, two of them African sociologists, and one of them actually a bush sociologist, but of French citizenship, exhibit this in a textual symptom of resisting the dominant leading approach to colonialism at the time, which was codified by the figure Georges Ballondier, whom I write a whole chapter about near the end, who coined this term, the colonial situation, and produced a kind of a sociology of colonies as dynamic, hybrid, conflictual, crisis-ridden, and deeply engaged with and implicated with and entangled with the European colonial society, as well as other societies within their own colonies, which used to be very separate. Now, these indigenous sociologists, two of whom I discuss in a lot of detail, actually moved from the Ballondier approach to one where they fell back into interwar anthropological primitivism, in which their own societies were described as being unaffected by colonialism and unengaged with the rest of the world. And I argue that this fallback is evidence of a kind of a textual symptom of a kind of a regression that reflects their field situation, and not, as one might suspect, simply their demographic background. Because others who didn't fall into that trap include, for example, Albert Memmi, who became the chair of the sociology department at Nanterre, and Abdelmalek Sayad, who was recruited into CNRS eventually with the help of Pierre Bourdieu, and his own work became really the founding work of post-colonial migration studies in France, as has recently been shown in great detail in Amin Perez's newly translated book with Polity Press on the friendship between Sayad and Pierre Bourdieu. The last part of the book is a series of biographies. I won't go over what each of them discovers, but I'll just name the four names for those who haven't had a chance to see the book. The first, perhaps unexpectedly, is Raymond Aron, not known as a theorist of imperialism and empire, but it turns out that was the foundation of his entire social scientific work as a result of being driven into exile by Nazism and analyzing Nazi imperialism in his first, some of his earliest work. Jacques Berck, who's the Orientalist whom Edward Said in Orientalist described as one of the two, I think, who'd managed to work himself out of Orientalism into a critique of Orientalism. And it also turns out is one of the first, along with Pierre Bourdieu, to call for decolonizing sociology. He's a specialist in North Africa and was born in Algeria and spent much of his research career in North Africa, and was in fact really the founder of a kind of a historical sociology that merges Annals school of historiography with the same attention to archival detail, but combining it with participant observation ethnography and using indigenous archives of Moroccan tribes in his work. So he's a fascinating and really excellent figure that sociology should be proud to have as one of its own, and mostly doesn't even know his name. Thirdly, Ballandier, I think Georges Ballandier is a fascinating figure who, as I've already said, created this concept of the colonial situation. He did foundational work on African churches in this period. He wrote one of the first books on a pre-colonial African kingdom, the Congo Kingdom, which is still very valuable for historians of Congo because he also did his ethnographic work in the same parts of Africa at the border of Angola and the French Congo, where the Congo Kingdom was based. Ballandier is the third figure, and then finally Bourdieu, who I argue generated his key categories in this colonial setting. Rather than going over that, I think I've run out of time now. The most important thing, I guess, here, in addition to the genesis of Bourdieu's concepts, which I tried to argue came out of this Algerian moment, is the intertextuality of his work with the other figures that I'm talking about. Berck and Ballandier are both thanked by Bourdieu in several of his works. Some of his concepts are a direct transcription of ideas from Berck and Ballandier. Our own, of course, was his second doctoral dissertation advisor. So this is an intertextual group and a social group that knew one another and were closely connected. And to put Bourdieu in this intellectual context, as well as this social context, I think is part of the goal here. I conclude with the idea that it would be an enormous mistake simply to re-entomb these figures after disinterring them. That's not how decolonizing sociology should go about. And I think that it's crucial to also consider, and that's where I conclude the book, why and how Bourdieu developed his ideas about reflexivity, his signature notion of reflexivity, with these two breaks, the break with one's own presuppositions, and then the break, or spontaneous pre-notions, and then the break with the spontaneous pre-notions of those one is studying, and then really a third break with one's own objectification, to see how those breaks and that epistemological distancing are so crucial to the decolonizing movement in intellectual history, and how they actually emerged from this late colonial moment that we're less familiar with today. So I end with that, and I'll just say I think I've become convinced through this book myself, at least, that reflexivity in social science requires the history of science, and the history of science requires this kind of reflexivity that Bourdieu introduced. So thanks very much.
Thank you, George, for this very succinct summary of the book. And I think one thing I want to just kind of echo upon what you said on the last is that what really struck me is how, I think contrary to the kind of Orientalist vision that colonized societies are kind of unchanging. And what I think you point out was that precisely these colonial sociologists or sociologists, colonialism, including Pierre Bourdieu, were able to produce theories that are very, like totalized, I guess, kind of big theory about social change, in part because, the colonial societies were actually, instead of unchanging, were the change of the scale of social change and conflict was so intense, right, that stimulated scholars to theorize about them. And I think that's really a very important takeaway from the book. So I wanted to mention that we have a lot of audience. We have over 200 attendees, and we also have many familiar faces, our sociology colleagues from the country or from the world. I want to, so the next, we'll move on to discussion. First, we'll have, initially the arrangement was have Professor Emmanuelle Saada to provide the initial comments because she knows the context probably the best. Now Matt Desan also knows tons a lot about French sociology and French politics, so we'll have him to give the first comment. Matt?
Okay, thank you, Xiaohong, and thanks, George. Apologies. I have two computer screens here, and my notes are on a different one, and so I'll be looking away from the camera. My apologies. Okay, so first, I want to congratulate George on the book, which is really an impressive achievement. It represents a truly staggering amount of research, and I'm sure it's going to serve as a valuable resource and reference for sociologists, historians, and other students of modern social thought for years to come. And what's truly mind-blowing to me is that I know this only represents one part of your research on the colonial entanglements of sociology, and that there's more to come, right? This 550-page book is really only a fraction of what you've been working on these past 10 years. And so I'm sure I speak for everybody when I say we're all looking forward to what's next as well. Okay, so I'm not a specialist in colonialism or post-colonial or decolonial theory. So my comments on the book will mainly engage what I took to be the main themes and arguments of the book from the perspective of a broader interest in intellectual history, French intellectual history in particular, and the sociology of intellectual life, and again, more particularly, the sociology of sociology. So I have two bigger sets of questions and comments, followed by some smaller observations and questions if I have time. Okay, so my first set of comments has to do with what I understood to be the overarching argument of the book, namely that what following Georges Ballandier and Jacques Berck, what we might call the colonial and decolonial situations, that these were the crucible for the forging of an anti-positivist, historicist, relational, processual, and dynamic sociology attuned to change, crisis, contingency, and overdetermination. Right? So in short, you argue that the colonial situation, despite its obvious injustice, was generative in intellectual terms. It was the specificity of this colonial situation, characterized by economic, political, social, and even spiritual relations of domination, which massively transformed colonized societies, and the process of decolonization, which obviously was also a massive source of massive social transformation, that these oriented sociologists working on colonial objects and in colonial settings toward the kind of anti-positivistic approaches that George, you've long championed, right? So the continuity here with your previous work, I think, is very clear. And one of the great merits of the book is that it recovers an alternative tradition of social thought that was contemporaneous with the heyday of positivist social science, but whose thinkers and works have tended to be repressed or neglected in our accounts of sociology's history. So my question, however, has to do with what we might compare your particular case to in the history of sociology and social thought, and particularly how specific you think this colonial nexus was in terms of providing the necessary context for the emergence of the kind of dynamic or historicist sociology you favor. Of course, lurking behind the entire book is a contrast with metropolitan post-war social science, whose positivist bent, you've argued in other writings, resonated with the relative social stability that characterized such societies. The sociologists you highlight in this book were more interesting, you suggest, because they were studying societies that were being dramatically transformed. And there I might be putting words in your mouth, but that's how I read it in any case. But how does this account of post-war colonial sociology relate to the standard account of the birth of sociology half a century prior as a science of modernity, and particularly a science of the massive social disturbances wrought by the transition to modernity? One of the things seemingly implied by your argument is that the true heirs of the founders of classical sociological theory, assuming we have a positive assessment of those founders, were to be found in the colonial periphery rather than the metropole, because the social conditions conducive to the elaboration of complex, dynamic, and non-positivist social theory, while those conditions no longer held in the metropole, they did in the colonies. And if this is the case, isn't this maybe a little uncomfortably close to a kind of modernization theory according to which the scene of the transition to modernity has simply shifted geographically? So I'll pose that question in kind of parentheses. This also raises the question of your argument's relationship to Raewyn Connell's argument in her foundational article, Why is Classical Theory Classical? Right? And I know you engage with that article a little bit in the book, so I'd like to sort of hear you kind of say more about that. Connell argued that classical American and European sociology were permeated by the colonial and imperial context of the time, from which it got its main conceptual framework and its data and methods. One could draw a line of continuity here between Connell's argument about the founders and your argument about French post-war colonial sociology, except, of course, that whereas for Connell, this colonial entanglement is reason to be critical and a source of epistemic errors, my words, not hers, you argue to the contrary that, to put it quite simply, it's what made them better sociologists, better at least than the positivists. So I'd like to hear you maybe say a little bit more about how you see your book's argument responding to possibly Connell's article. All right, so the second major theme of the book is the question of scientific autonomy and heteronomy. Right, so in the chapter on Jacques Berck, you write that, quote, one of the demi-regularities that we can glean from the present study is that scholars who experience intense pressure to align their research with external powers often embrace scientific freedom most emphatically, especially if this desire for autonomy resonates with other elements of their personality. And that's from page 265. And I just want to flag here, I thought the way you put it, the desire for autonomy was quite interesting. So I'll circle back to that in a second. So I don't think you quite follow up on this really interesting point in the conclusion. But one of the things I think your book does is it challenges us to move beyond seeing autonomy and heteronomy as a simple binary and pushes us to think more deeply about the two and how the two are related. So what I found striking, particularly in your discussion of the four main figures at the end of the book, is actually how difficult it is to categorize these figures as heteronymous or autonomous without resorting to various qualifications and specifications. As you say, what they have in common is that they all, in their own way, struggled with this question of autonomy and heteronomy. And yet, what struck me is how different their situations and trajectories were in this regard. So, for example, Raymond Aron's trajectory was in the direction of heteronomy, even if he did maintain a foot in the academic world, in that he wrote primarily for a public audience through his journalism. At the same time, of the four figures you discuss at the end, he was the least implicated in colonial institutions. And indeed, as a kind of free-floating public intellectual, arguably enjoyed a degree of autonomy in choosing his objects that some of the others you discuss didn't. So there's a peculiar combination here, I think, of heteronomy in terms of audience and autonomy in terms of, say, object choice, what to write about, right? Okay, so Jacques Berck was an entirely different creature. He began his career in colonial administration, participating in various colonial reform schemes, before becoming a critic of this kind of heteronymous colonial science and moving politically in an anti-colonial direction. His trajectory was, as you characterize it, a, quote, political and epistemological mutiny against heteronymous colonial science. Indeed, you refer to him as a, quote, mutineer inside the colonial administration, suggesting that his arc is defined less by autonomy per se in an institutional sense, than a sort of inside but against struggle from within the heteronymous pole of the field. Ballandier also follows a different trajectory, right? So he too starts as a colonial civil servant, participating in various colonial development schemes. And though you describe him as, quote, an anti-colonial employee of the colonial state, and though his intellectual and scholarly output achieved the kind of recognition, I think, denied some of the more heteronymous, quote, Bush sociologists you discussed earlier in the book, it's also true that Ballandier's trajectory is never really marked by a clean break from heteronomy, at least as I read it, right? So as you point out, some of his projects continued to be initiated by the High Commissioner of French Equatorial Guinea, and his affiliation with ORSTOM, the Office of Colonial Scientific Research, lasted until 1973. Despite this, you say that Ballandier, quote, managed to maintain his scientific autonomy. But this only raises the question to me of whether you consider autonomy to be a social or institutional position, or rather a property of knowledge itself. In any case, what's interesting, I think, about Ballandier and your account of Ballandier is the disjuncture between a checkered institutional trajectory in terms of his autonomy and heteronomy, and what I think you convincingly show is really the sort of the unimpeachable scientific quality of his work. And then finally, Bourdieu's case is different yet again, in that in a way, he starts out as the most compromised in terms of this heteronymous position relative to specifically the repressive arm of colonial domination through his work for the information service of the French army. But of course, then he works to refute colonialist ideology through his subsequent fieldwork in Algeria, and then later moves away from colonial objects altogether. And of course, throughout the rest of his career, he cuts the consummate figure of the autonomous intellectual, right? So in terms of their autonomy and heteronomy, what stands out to me is how unlike these four figures are. They can't be neatly categorized into autonomous or heteronymous poles, nor is there always a clear dividing line between their heteronymous and autonomous periods. But maybe the point of all this is that autonomy and heteronomy aren't binary categories that mutually exclude one another. We can further differentiate according to what branch of the colonial state one is tied to, right here, making the distinction perhaps between Bourdieu's distinction between the left hand and the right hand of the state. So to work for the Colonial Research Office is not the same as producing wartime propaganda for the information service of the French army. Moreover, trajectory matters, right? Those who move from more constraining forms of heteronomy to win a margin of autonomy may have a different appreciation of what such autonomy means and the intellectual responsibility which it entails, compared to someone born, so to speak, into a situation of professional autonomy, right? And finally, the spirit of scientific autonomy, or indeed, as you very suggestively say, the desire for autonomy, is maybe not always reducible to an institutional position of autonomy. So this more complex entanglement of autonomy and heteronomy is, I think, one of the more interesting lessons of your book. So to circle back to that passage that I quoted of yours in the Jacques Berck section, and I don't have a specific question here, but maybe just, again, asking you to elaborate on this theme of scientific autonomy and heteronomy. I think one of the more interesting suggestions of your book is that much of what we consider to be the virtues of scientific autonomy in terms of producing good knowledge maybe has less to do with autonomy considered statically, right, as a condition, right, and is better understood dynamically, if you will, right, as a product of a struggle for autonomy. In that sense, perhaps autonomy is only truly meaningful when it has been won against heteronomy, right? And this might take us outside the scope of your book, but I think this has all sorts of interesting lessons for how we think about these questions, contemporarily in an era where it often feels like the values of scientific autonomy are threatened from the outside and undermined from even within academia. And so I think I'm out of time, but Xiaohong, do I have time for just one more thing? So yeah. The last thing I wanted to bring up, I have a couple. Maybe I'll email you some of the rest of my little observations and stuff and questions. But one thing I did want to bring up, and I wanted to ask you first in open-ended terms, to maybe elaborate a bit more on why you chose those four figures at the end of the book: Raymond Aron, Jacques Berck, Georges Ballandier, and Pierre Bourdieu, because I think in some ways it's perhaps not an obvious grouping, and maybe talk a little bit about, who are some other figures that you could have talked about that you didn't, right? And there's one person in particular whose name comes up for me, and you discuss him in relation to Ballandier, and that's, of course, Claude Lévi-Strauss. Now, right, not a colonial sociologist in quite the same way, but at the time, at least, a sociologist, right, or considered as much of a sociologist as an anthropologist. There's a Simone de Beauvoir review in Les Temps Modernes about of the elementary structures of kinship, in which she refers to him as a sociologist. Now, you discuss Lévi-Strauss in relation to Ballandier, and you set up a polarity between Ballandier and Lévi-Strauss. And I think that polarity makes sense within the terms of your argument because, as you say on page 302, Ballandier suggested that the formal and technical character of Lévi-Strauss's structuralism resonated with the technicism of post-war French society. So if you're setting up this opposition between, say, a historicist sociologist and an anti-historicist sociology, that polarity makes sense. On the other hand, surely Lévi-Strauss, right, then structuralism is not historicist, is explicitly anti-historicist, privileging synchronic analyses over diachronic analyses. And yet, in other ways, Lévi-Strauss, I think, it's a mistake. And here, Ballandier's characterization is, I think, a bit polemical and mistaken. We can't assimilate Lévi-Strauss to this sort of post-war technicist, positivist social science, because Lévi-Strauss's structuralism is also resolutely anti-empiricist, right? And also, one of the things that characterizes it is a kind of depth realist ontology of the kind that you've also championed in other work. And I was just rereading THiS de Tropique recently, and there's a very excellent, really interesting passage in there where Lévi-Strauss talks about geology, Marxism, and psychoanalysis as the three sort of scientific disciplines that really that exhibit this kind of depth realist ontology, right? That the sort of surface appearance of things can't explain the surface phenomena, right? That you have to go underneath, beneath the surface, so to speak, right? And so that is, this obviously, you don't have to write about structuralism. Plenty has been written about structuralism, but structuralism can't be assimilated to post-war positivist social science, but represents in a way an alternative anti-positivist current from the current the historicist current that you write about in your book. And of course, in the figure of Pierre Bourdieu, those two things kind of come together, right? I mean, you discuss Bourdieu's structuralism in the structuralist essay on the Kabyle house, but you sort of kind of explain that away as like, well, this is kind of more of an exercise in structuralism than really something that represents the core of his thought. But in fact, I think those two things are maybe more connected in Bourdieu than you let on. So anyway, I've gone over my time, so I'll end it there.
Thank you, Matt, for this fascinating comments. And next, we'll have Ho-Fung.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Hong, for organizing this and inviting me, and thanks, George, for writing this book. It is really a very nice summer treat that I can't say I read it in one sitting. It is impossible, 550 pages. But once I started, it's so gripping that I can't do anything else until I finish reading it for a whole day, for a few days. So it is really, really, really good. So I'm going to keep it short, and mostly I have one great praise and a few questions and one disagreement. The disagreement is about the strategy of decolonizing sociology that you suggest in the conclusion sections. So for the great praise is that it is much more obviously it's much more than about French sociologies or French colonial sociology. It has a lot that from the American sociology perspective has a lot to learn from it, because you put it into the context, and then you do it beautifully in the book. Is that this Western and particularly French academia and sociology that actually France is not well known, particularly for being progressive and anti-racist, but that in the academia in France there's a lot, like you mentioned, the father of modern racism, Gobineau, that is in France, and also in the period of 1930s to 1960s, this kind of a biological racism that regard different races as biological group and subspecies that so they are so different, their characters are so different that you cannot apply the same category to study different people. So this kind of biological and saying that race are genetically based, and this everywhere in France and in the Western social science, and also the other extreme is this radical universalism, that thinking that all society follow the same path of evolutions. So you don't need to study India because we just need to study 16th century England. Because 16th century England is today's India, so they are in the primitive stage of earlier stage of the same evolutionary process. So it is everywhere, even today. But in 1930s to 1960s, you can imagine how much kind of revolutionary thinking that this group of colonial sociologists in France has to overcome to get to what you describe in the book as all these kind of ideas. To compare, for example, to compare agrarian France with agrarian Arab countries on a kind of equal footing, and also to develop concept, like in Boulder case, to develop concepts from his observations in Algerian society and bring it back to apply to metropoles. To French society. So it is really revolutionary in particularly in that context of 1930s to 1960s, when this high racism and high evolutionism is everywhere in France and in Western social science in general. And then how they do it is that it is this kind of a critical juncture or magical moment when there's an empire, and then so these people are circulating within the empire in different places in the interstices of mainstreams. And structures and mainstream institutions, and at the same time, it is not only it is not the age of high colonialism. In the French case, it is already, you see this kind of anti-colonial movement going up. So these people are not only in the interstices of institutions and in different parts of empire, but they are also in the interstices of the colonizer and the colonial resistance. So it is this kind of a cross-boundary movement, and flow of these people enable these people to have this kind of perspective, and also they are influenced by this historicist perspective to historicize the thing that they observe, and so it is how they actually overcome Orientalism, who see this kind of Eastern or non-Western society and static whole. So this is kind of a very much example to show that transnational and historical comparative sociology should be at the core of any sociology, that it is to be core perspective, because this kind of a historical comparative perspective and transnational perspective and practice of research is actually the thing that enable us to see these very interesting and innovative ideas and get at these kind of concepts. Actually, it is an exercise of provincializing the kind of sociology that only focus on Western society and see it as universal. So it is the great contribution to the discipline and to wider social science, not only sociology, definitely. So my question is, there's a couple that I'm sure that maybe the book is already too long, that you don't have space to get to that yet, but I would like to hear your thought about this number of things. And so that you mentioned that this kind of a magical moment, or this kind of a colonial sociology, the memory and the practice is suppressed later on, after all. So my question is that I would like to hear more about why it was suppressed later on, and then that it all get back to this kind of 19th century stereotypical division of labor of disciplines. That is, sociology deal with industrialized, advanced societies, and anthropology deal with the primitive and underdeveloped, and then area studies, Orientalist scholarship deal with the high culture, that high culture. So it seems that the story ended when this kind of a memory, even people no longer want to talk too much about it, and Bourdieu was remembered in the discipline for his works about French high culture and even cuisine and all this kind of France oriented, and his earlier works about Algeria was not exactly forgotten, but downplayed. And why this repression happened after all, after this window closed. And another question is that you cite Bourdieu's Homo academicus a few times, but didn't get into details of the analysis. The one interesting thing about the Bourdieu's Homo academicus is that he explained the 1968 from a perspective of a reproduction crisis of the ruling elite and the crisis of higher education. And then he talked about why there's so many sociologists in the barricades And he says something that not many people want to hear as sociologists, because because the sociology has a lot of students who are the not so well performers in academic of the bourgeois kids, so that they are facing this credibility, that this kind of a degree inflation, and they have a horrible job prospects. So they are the kind of people who are facing this downward mobility. So it is the kind of concentrated manifestation of this crisis of bourgeois class reproduction. So he has this kind of a class analysis and political economy of the disciplines, and to explain their action. And then I would like to hear more about, because you talk about a lot of about the backgrounds of the academics in colonial sociology. But what about the students? Because the institution cannot sustain without enough students enrolled and getting the certificate and things like that. So what are the background of these people? And I don't know the empirical situation there, but I suspect, or I hypothesize, or I imagine it, maybe it is a possibility. Would it be a possibility that this is the marginality of the discipline and the colonial sociology and the students, and this marginality actually become a blessing to enable the space for these people to see things that other more mainstream, like philosophy and socially dominant people cannot see. So would it be like Mathieu said, that it is these sociology students who are witnessing the crisis of class reproduction that enable them to be unhappy about the status quo and see through the status quo, the problem of it, the crisis of it. So it is why they become revolutionary and at the barricades. So it is my questions about this. What are the backgrounds of these students besides the scholars? And another question that is resonate with Matthew's question about this choice of these four the colonial sociologies, and my concern is that why don't choose also some people who are actually not from France going to the colony, but also from the colonies, like you mentioned in passing a lot, like Albert Memmi, and also Ansor Abdulmanak. So they are from the colonies or the spheres of influence, and then they are the Arabs, the Arab Jews and Tunisians, and then later taught in Paris, in France, and went back to the metropoles. So I would like to hear more about these kind of cases. You mentioned that it is not a lot, but actually it would be interesting if you can like elaborate on what is the thought and what is the contribution, but particularly Abdulmanak. And I read his book early on in my context of my own research. He writes The Orientalism in Crisis. Actually, it is the first systematic critique of Orientalism before Said. Even there's some accusation that actually Said, he cite him, but many of the ideas of Oversea actually come from him. The Orientalism in Crisis is published in the 1960s. So basically, this kind of a interesting example. Maybe he wrote mostly in French, not in English. So maybe it is one reason why he's overshadowed by Said. But it will be very interesting to include this case. And another example is that I not in sociology, but in French economics that I know a little bit about because I looked into this history. And then you had a long paragraph about Semi Amin, that is this radical political economy in France, the French dependency school. I look into it, and actually it's very interesting phenomenon in economics. And I wonder why it seems not happening in sociology as you describe it, because in French, in particular in Paris, the political economy, the radical political economy that become dependency school, scholars from Indochina play a large role in it. But of course it ended up in tragedy, because many of the leaders of the Khmer Rouge regimes has a PhD in economics in Sorbonne, and two of them, that's Khieu Samphan and Hao Yuan, who found the Kampuchea Communist Party. They were in the Paris student group in the 1950s, hanging out with Semi Amin and then getting to all this radical idea about dependency and radical delinking. But then they later went back to Cambodia to teach in university, and then involved in the movement with Pol Pot, and then the rest is history. So I wonder whether this kind of things happen in the colonial sociology. That is this where did this kind of the people from the colonized people that they get trained in either in Paris or in the colonial universities, and then some of them we know that like Albert Macmillan and Abdul Malak taught in their native society and then went to Paris. But some of them stay behind in their home formerly colonized countries? And what did they do? And what did they contribute in the nation state building process in those places? And my side question is that why Indochina is not quite there in sociology? Is it a sociology phenomenon? Because I know in economics, in 1950s, at least in the radical political economy, Indochina is very important. The students and scholars from Indochina. But in sociology, we see the people from Africa, from the Arab world, but not much in Indochina. And Tunisia and Vietnam gained independence about the same time in the 1950s, and even after that, I bet France still have a lot of influence in South Vietnam and in the university institution and things like that. So where is Indochina in all this? This is my side question. I don't have enough time to go over all the questions. I have more, but I get to the slight disagreement and about the strategy of decolonizing sociology. The thing I particularly disagree about is that you mentioned Carl Smith, that I have a huge issue with, that you are trying to save the canons of these theories by saying that you need to read all of their works, put them in context to really fully understand it. But my question about Carl Smith and Weber is that even if you read fully about their works, you still can identify some of their fundamental problem and the limitation, and we need to reckon with it and confront with it. I know, and I share with your, I think it is hidden or underneath is that there's this resistance to too easily cancel our canon. I'm not supporting canceling our canon because they have their limitation and problem. The limitation is they inherit from their age. For example, Weber, particularly, that you mentioned his books on China and also in Hinduism and Buddhism. Yes, that he has a lot of sophisticated things to say about India and China, but he did lump the two together in the very end of the religion of Hinduism. There's a concluding chapter called The Character of Asiatic Religion. Exactly, he's saying that after all, they're all the same. They're all magical and irrational and things like that. And his works on China, you rightly point out that in the Orientalist and racist stuff inherit from the source he cite, that is De Groot, and also another one in James Lack. And it doesn't mean that he's okay, that he is still very problematic, but not that the problems come from his own thought or his own research, but he inherit from the thing he cite, and it is the limitation is that we need to reckon with. But the strategy of comparison itself is problematic because when he's comparing Hinduism, Buddhism, and Confucianism and Taoism, he's comparing these huge religious tradition as a homogeneous whole that didn't change for hundreds, if not thousands of years, that he cite things from like the 100 BC and then jump to 1600. But when he's comparing with the Occidental religion, Christianity, he's particularly talking about Calvinism that prevailed in certain parts of Europe in a certain time in the 17th century. But he's not talking about the whole Christianity from the Roman Empire to all the way to the 19th century. But so this kind of what you can do when you're talking about Eastern culture is that you can do this overgeneralizing and very highly non-differentiated talk. When that you cannot do it to Occidental culture, you have to be very nuanced and detailed. This kind of a comparison, unbalanced comparison itself is a problem. We need to reckon with it. And also, Carl Schmitt is another thing that you are saying that people are saying that he's anti-Semitic by looking at his letters and things like that. But the thing is that his philosophy writing didn't have explicit anti-Semitic stuff in there. But many times, even though in American politicians, during the Jim Crow era, they are supporting this kind of a segregation and thing. They are not particularly citing racist stuff and saying racist thing. They are talking about the literacy test, and then people are just not educated enough and things like that. But you know that what they mean by that by looking at what they say in private, what they hang out with, and then what is their political kind of association. So I'm still in supportive of the methodology to look at these people letters and their private life and their political life in particular, and then to as part of the context of what they write, rather than just looking at what they write. Particularly in the case of Carl Schmitt, that he refused to declassify after 1945. So much so that he was denied teaching jobs in any German university and living in the cabin so after what we know about what the Nazi did to the Jews, that he still refused to declassify. So definitely that anti-Semitism is a key of his theory. You cannot distinguish his theory, his writing from this anti-Semitism that is lurking underneath, even though it might not be explicit. So to decolonize sociology in conclusion, that I would like I agree with the thrust of your argument that it is a bad idea to cancel everybody of any canon if we find any single racist remark they make or whatever, but we need to really reckon with and really confront their limitation and their problems and in full force. And then to try to contextualize their contribution by being alert to their limitation and their problem. So here's my 2 cents, and again, and thanks a lot for the book, and I look forward to the other volumes, and also to your response to my question. But thank you.
Thank you. This is a very stimulating discussion, and next, we will move on to Nick Wilson. Nick.
Hi there. If Ho-Fung gave you his 2 cents, I'm going to give you 1 cent, which is to say I am here not as a French historian, not literate in French, and not a modern historian or historical social scientist. I am a early modern sort of British imperial fella. And by consequence, I want to take a little bit of a different tack, which is to try to take yet another sort of step back from this amazing book and sort of ask, how does it fit into the contemporary space of American, maybe even global sociology? What makes this a book of the moment, and how can we sort of prod that in interesting ways? So, as everybody does in these kinds of responses, I'll begin by praising the book and then prod you in a couple of different directions. So first, praise. I wanna divide my praise into 3 different dimensions. The first is biographical, which is to say, this book, I think, is a new height in an already impressive career studying the structures and logic of modern colonialism and the sociology and philosophy of social scientific knowledge. I was really intimidated to hear that this is going to be part of a trilogy. And I think that speaks to another sort of fascinating and impressive aspect of your career, which is its coherence. I think very few of us, I certainly couldn't sustain the kind of focus and intertextual coherence that George has over the course of his writing. So I think that's incredibly impressive. Second bit of praise is analytical. I think this book represents a key kind of productive return to a Bourdieusian relationalism enlivened by a deepened theory of the subject, which George draws from psychoanalysis, and which I'll come back to later, and a kind of re-specified depth realist philosophy of science. My simple point is, after this book, you know, all of us who work in the sort of historical sociology of empire and colonialism feel this push and pull between a kind of actualist comparative case infrastructure to our research designs and to our analysis. And then what I think George is doing, which is this deep sort of unearthing of these generative structures that lay at the heart of what gets manifested at the actual or empirical level. So put a little bit differently, after this book, I don't think you can go back to that older sort of actualist case comparative architecture. I think this really puts that to bed. Now, substantively, I'd like to situate this book as the confluence of 3 different threads. I think it's part of a historically embedded sociology, of a tradition of historically embedded sociologies of knowledge. George cites Mannheim very directly, but I'd also like to point out Steve Chapin's A Social History of Truth, which is an account of where the sort of objectivist epistemological stance that we identify so centrally with positivism came from. But then also Charles Kamick's much neglected dissertation book, which is about, the super title I think is Experience and Enlightenment. And it's an account essentially of the marginal, dare I say, colonized position of some of the intellectuals in the Scottish Enlightenment. And it makes basically the argument drawn from socialization theory that that's where you get some of the key ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment, which in turn was so important to British and then global intellectual modernity. So that's thread one. The second thing is that I love how this book scales between this sort of breathtaking prosopographical field analysis of context within context within context, but then also does these intense biographical sort of demonstrative chapters on Raymond Aron and Pierre Bourdieu. This to me fits in the tradition, and these chapters are of the quality of works like Neil Gross's book-length treatment on Richard Rorty, and then Gary's book-length treatment on C. Wright Mills and his intellectual context. So then finally, of course, you can't talk about a book like this without talking about empire. And here, the sort of obvious points of grounding are in Ray Wing Connell's work, and Gurminda Bhambra's, and the real efflorescence of colonial, the sociology of colonialism that we're living through now. But one of the things I find most exciting about the book is that it refuses this sort of facile colonizing colonized dichotomy and the kind of moral freight that can also come with it, and instead offers this beautiful, supple reading of post-war French sociology. I, for one, am never going to be able to read Bourdieu's Habitus again without thinking of this concept of Nia. And it's so fascinating to me that sort of retrospectively, Bourdieusian habitus was reconstructed basically as an Aristotelian concept, where this feels like a real strong demonstration that that just wasn't the case. So enough of talking about why this book is great and you should all read it. Let me prod the argument in a few different directions. And I'm taking inspiration here, I should say, from some of George's comments and some of the discussion that we've already had, which is that this book really, I think, is meant to stand as a demonstration of how to do reflexive historical social science really well. And with that in mind, I'd like to just ask a couple of clarifying questions. The first is, in the conclusion, George notes that before we, in Ho-Fung's terms, cancel a colonial sociologist, we need to carefully read all of their work. To me, this gets us into really thorny questions of canonization, not as an endowment of symbolic capital, but as a practical heuristic method of cutting down what Andy Abbott calls the problem of excess, which is simply the fact that no one of us has the capability to read all of this stuff. It is a lifetime to do this for a single author or even a small group of them. So for humble working social scientists, I wonder what this project of careful, nuanced recovery practically looks like. Is it a matter of having very smart sociologists digest this and sort of pronounce upon it? Is it a matter of making the work more accessible, creating readers? I don't know, and I'd like to hear. The second thing is an epistemological question that goes, I think, to Ho-Fung's questions about Schmidt and Weber. And I'd like to potentiate his questions a little bit, just in the sense that I am a follower of the kind of depth realist ontology that you're suggesting, have been for a while, love it. However, one of my sort of longstanding questions about it, which I think is very germane here, is whether it so privileges ontology as a reactive move against the hyper-privileging of epistemology in standard positivism, right? Positivism and its epistemological focus is so much on how do we reliably stabilize our understanding of the correspondence of our theories to reality. Of course, the ontological move is to insist, well, what's really important is the structure of reality. But then I think that introduces problems back into the equation of, well, what happens when very smart, well-meaning, good faith people dispute one's interpretation of, say, Weber or Carl Schmitt, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that this is an important question, especially for historical social science, because it's so rare for the empirical record to be complete enough for there to be just decisive end of story consensus over our interpretation of historical social reality. Okay, sort of shamelessly picking a fight here. You clearly are very taken with psychoanalysis, and I note that that's pretty orthogonal to contemporary sociology of culture approaches to the way meaning and action intersect. I would say the dominant approach these days is drawn from cognitive and social psychology, which long ago, in an act of self-immolation or self-purification, discarded Freudian approaches. And since I came up with this question, I've thought about it a little bit more, and I wonder if part of what's going on here is that you see the architecture of repression as being fundamentally more generative than non-conscious behavior, in the sense that when something's repressed, it has a bunch of potentials to be sublimated into a bunch of different directions. And I don't really see that same architecture in some of the sort of unconscious or non-conscious stuff in contemporary cognitive and social psych. And then also, the language of repression scales much better than cognitive and social psych, in the sense that you can talk about the repression of an entire field, its entire unconscious, in a way that works a little differently. So I'd like to hear more about that. Okay, so last two things, which I'll just say very quickly. I don't know if this is a matter of wrangling back and forth with the publisher, but I note that there's a real gap between the main title and the subtitle of this book, The Colonial Origins of Modern Social Thought, both in the singular, French Sociology and the Overseas Empire. Now, in your comments, George, you talked about France being the most dramatic example of this kind of repression and sublimation, but I'd like to hear a little bit more of the sort of classic Hegelian now post-colonial question of, to what extent do you mean this as a kind of dialectical subsumption of French sociology as a kind of synecdoche for all of modern social thought? And if not, what else should we be looking for? And then finally, I'm quite happy with decolonizing, but I also want to press you a little bit on reflexivity as epistemic vigilance. You very clearly want to return to what I take to be a pretty basically Bourdieusian account of what reflexivity looks like, which I agree with you is absolutely not standpoint epistemology, strong objectivity, or anything like that. I would actually call this strong reflexivity, in a kind of nod to the strong objectivity arguments. But one of the dissatisfactions that I don't necessarily see resolved here, at least to my own satisfaction, is how this avoids becoming ultimately a variety of scholasticism. And what I mean by that is the epistemic break with your research participants, research subjects, pre-notions as well. I get what that's trying to do, is that it's fundamentally a kind of liberatory move. It's to help enrich people's understandings of their own worlds such that they can live better, more flourishing lives. That's certainly what Bourdieu thought he was doing. But I also think that really is a really tricky thing and depends in really complicated ways on the architecture of the academic field that's doing it. And I think this gets to Mathieu's question about autonomy versus heteronomy. I think we need to be a little bit more careful in asking autonomy from whom and on what terms. And I think that that's incredibly important, not just to any question of decolonizing sociology, but also the broader movement to actually be relevant in the worlds we live in. So I'll stop there.
Okay.
That's great. Thanks, Nick. So I would like to invite George Steinmetz to respond to the comments maybe for 5 to 10 minutes. In the meantime, I want to invite audience to submit your questions in a Q&A section. Unfortunately, the website webinar setting does not allow you to put your questions in the chat box. So just put in a Q&A section.
5 minutes for all of that, George.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is an impossible task, I'll first say, because all of these comments have been extremely thought-provoking. So if I miss one of the points or if I skim over it, don't take it as me either not being interested or not wanting to continue the discussion. First of all, on Matt, I thank you for, and I said this to Chaz Kamek when he commented on this book, thank you for kind of extracting an argument that I think was hopefully implicit, but not as explicit as the way you've made it. I totally agree with you. I think one of the advantages of constructing an intellectual history along this architecture, all the way from super macro contexts, all the way down to the psyche of the individual and the text, is that you can indeed play these terms out, autonomy and heteronomy, at all those different levels. And I think Nick touched on this at the very end when he talked about, autonomy from what? I mean, clearly autonomy for an individual like Georges Valaudier, as I described here, is deeply determined by his personal relationship, both to his own ancestors, whom he talks about incessantly, but especially to this figure of Michel Leris, who's his mentor, and who has precisely this mixture of psychoanalytic literary writing and fieldwork ethnography. And so there's a question of whether autonomy from a figure like that is the same as autonomy from a sociology discipline that wants you to do X, not Y. Obviously not. And this concept of autonomy needs to be an entire subfield of theoretical discussion in sociology in and of itself. And you've hit upon that very nicely. I think you asked why these four figures. Clearly, I had to make a selection, and I selected them because I thought they exemplified different aspects of this set of concepts that I'm drawing on here. I think it's probably obvious, having read the book to you, that I didn't do a psychoanalytic approach to. I didn't even pretend to do a psychoanalysis of Raymond Aron, and partially that's because I think these other factors do great justice to his work. His explicit political nonconformism from his youth in the his very earliest engagement with nonconformism is such a red thread throughout his work that it's almost as if we add that to his intense personal experience of Nazism, of the oppressiveness of Nazi imperialism, and his intellectual background in this brilliant French philosophical tradition that he was trained in. And he, like Bourdieu, was #1 in his class when he graduated from the École Normale in philosophy. Those three things together do so much that you almost don't need the psychoanalytic. But with Ballandier, it's also dripping with these connotations of ego ideals and ideal egos. Some of the scenes in his autobiographical novel of sexuality, for example, are drawn directly from or echo directly the surrealists' work on those topics, and Larisse's in particular. So it's clearly much more needed. I think I'm trying to find where I wrote. Okay, so Connell, but two people brought up the question of this relationship to the early sociology and this mid-century post-war sociology. Now, Connell argued that they were steeped in a kind of an imperial mindset in the foundational period, but that they withdrew back to empire after World War II, and then begins the canonization of Parsonian sociology that essay culminates in. First of all, empirically, that's incorrect. I mean, it turns out that the sociology discipline was most involved with colonialism when expertise was most central to colonialism. And that was the period of late 1930s, especially 1940, through to the end of colonialism. But also that this sociology was, in many respects, different from the kind of sociology that had been oriented toward colonialism in the foundational period. Nobody wants to revive the work of those people. Someone like Sumner on colonialism, those people should remain unread, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, of course, an intellectual history of imperialism may want to talk about them because they played a role, perhaps, in the Anti-Imperialist League in the United States, and so on and so forth. But as thinkers for our discipline, or as worthy of this kind of extended treatment, you need people who are sort of eligible for that. And I think these thinkers are. Ultimately, that's going to be, the proof will be in the pudding. If an intellectual historian chooses someone, and then at the end of the chapter you say, no, I didn't learn anything from this, clearly it was a false choice, and then it's a choice of some sort of other sort. But the point I wanted to make about intellectual autonomy in relation to that is, and one of the themes in the book is the intense focus on autonomy and academic freedom, even in this period among the actors themselves. The occupation of France, Nazi Germany, the rise of groups like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which poured a lot of money into Europe, and much of the money was used for purposes that the CIA knew nothing about and had nothing to do with. And it became a kind of a theme among intellectuals in Europe after World War II, the idea of the need for struggling for scientific autonomy became an explicit theme among these people themselves. And so it's not just me imposing the autonomy theme on them. Scientific autonomy was there. The UNESCO even had a journal dedicated to the study of science, which was focused on scientific autonomy. Why these four figures? Okay, so why not Levi-Strauss? And for example, why not others? Well, it's a good point. I mean, one of the temporal design features of it is that I kind of end the study when colonialism ends. And then I follow it through for a couple of years after decolonization, precisely because of this ambiguous period, especially in the African colonies, when the French continued and the British, in their case, continued to control the universities and the research institutes for a number of years afterwards. But structuralism became a dominant theoretical framework, I think, really in the 1960s in France. That's what people like Bourdieu himself said. And it's a little toward the end of my period. Of course, Levi-Strauss was a professor of sociology in Sao Paulo. He was initially considered to be, but by the time this ends, the colonial period ends, he's clearly differentiating anthropology from sociology. I mean, in structural anthropology, there's a whole chapter where he kind of really distorts what sociology is in order to drive a wedge between them. This is part of the disciplinary boundary formations that I'm talking about here, where anthropology and sociology are sometimes fluidly collaborating, and people like Ballandier genuinely profit from going back and forth between the two disciplines of having a foot in both. But in other respects, they're struggling viciously over the ontological object of the colony or the post-colony, who owns that. And Levi-Strauss versus Ballandier is the prime example of such a struggle. Ballandier claims, and many others claim, that Lévi-Strauss personally dedicated himself to keeping Ballandier out of the Collège de France, for example, which is the pinnacle of achievement in the intellectual sphere in France. And Ballandier, is struggling along these lines too. He's differentiating his approach out from Lévi-Strauss's. So it's part of the object itself, the differentiation between anthropology and sociology in this period. Lévi-Strauss and Ballandier are the two kind of key actors actually in that. I think Bourdieu is much more relaxed about that distinction. Moving on to Ho-Fung, Ho-Fung talks about racism and universalism that were so crucial for the for French thought. One of the key features of this, I totally agree with what your reading of what I'm trying to argue here, is that this tradition of sociology was kind of orthogonal to or outside of those main traditions from the very start. The Durkheimian tradition began with its rejection of racism. The anti-racism of the Dreyfus campaign was the foundation of the Durkheimians, and according to Christophe Charles, the foundation of the entire modern category of the intellectual, especially in France. And so anti-racism is inscribed into sociology very early on. Now, there, of course, are racist strands within French sociology, and Mathieu's work is about one of those important strands. And there are other strands as well, especially during the Vichy period. But they are so marginal to the post-war period. They are utterly invisible, one could say, even if there's a kind of a struggling against them that drives each of the four figures that I'm talking about to put racism and race at the center of their definition of the colonial state. Bourdieu, in his first book, Sociology of Algeria, describes the French colonial state as a machine for producing racists. All of these figures foreground this. So I think it's an excellent point that that this is kind of a major formation against which they're partially reacting, and that it's not simply a reaction to the racism on the ground in the colonies that does this. Otherwise, all of the other disciplines would have foregrounded this as well, and anthropology included, which I don't think was the case in the 1940s and the 50s in French anthropology. Now, the relative marginality of sociology does play a role in this. And you talked about the recruitment of the students into sociology as well. I mean, Bourdieu thematizes this quite explicitly throughout in his autobiography and in other writings. Ballandier describes himself as a man from the provinces who, barely made it into academia and then, immediately shot off to Africa at his first opportunity in 1946. Berck was born in Algeria. His personal papers are in a small Algerian town. And Aron was, by definition, marginal. His career began with a marginalization. He was a professor for a couple of years, and then he was driven into exile. Now, of course, he made it back into the core. But one of the things about his role as a journalist, as that pointed out, and as I try to argue, is that it allowed him to maintain a kind of an autonomy both from academia by being a kind of an academic journalist and from journalism. And he played a significant role in the public debate on decolonizing Algeria with his two books. He's not the only one by any means. Of course, there was Sartre and other prominent people, but let's not forget how close Sartre and Aron actually were at the beginning, and that they were close friends in the interwar period, and they divided politically. But these two figures that we think of as kind of on opposite sides of the spectrum came from precisely the same philosophical training and were close in many ways. Ho-Fung also brings up, why is this suppressed? I do have a discussion of that in the book, and I think it's probably all I have to say about that. But the main reason, which I don't think has come up yet, is the repression of the entire memory of colonialism in European colonizing countries, which set in almost immediately at the moment of decolonization. There's only a couple of years in which it remained a major topic in the newspapers. In the British case, which I think illustrates this the most dramatically, every social scientific student who wanted money to go overseas to do research before 1962 had to apply to the Colonial Social Science Research Council. There was no other funding other than a couple of philanthropic institutions. After 1962, a couple of years later, is created the Social Science Research Council. And the people who write about the history of British sociology say that was the birth moment of British sociology. Well, look at all the people who founded the social sciences in Britain. They all were colonial social science fellows, not all of them, but many, many of them, from Jack Goody to Michael Banton to Peter Worsley. Well, Peter Worsley wasn't a fellow, but it goes on and on. But the amnesia set in immediately. And the amnesia was a function, partially a repeat process after denazification. When Nazism ended in Germany and the occupation ended in France, the great shame, the public shame about this object, about collaborationism, resulted in shoveling underground of a lot of these memories, a deliberate practice of amnesia. It's not a passive thing, amnesia. Amnesia is an active process of making something forgotten. And that's precisely what happened. It was shameful, and as it became shameful for the more educated classes, at least in France, it was forgotten. Many of the figures who worked in the colonies became metrocentric sociologists. Even Ballandier, in one of his best-known books, the Political Anthropology, which he wrote at the end of the 60s, he begins to forget that he was ever a colonial sociologist. And the colonialism topic is kind of hidden at the back of the book. So there's a massive process of repressing the collective memory of colonialism, which is only now, as we speak, reemerging into the French public sphere with Macron's partial apology for colonialism in Algeria, with the beginnings of the restitution of pillaged masks and other human remains and things from the colonies. Only in the last literally 3 or 4 years has that topic been reopened. Secondly, there's the stigma that's attached to unworthy, illegitimate objects, which is a topic that Bourdieu wrote about quite extensively. And a third is what you brought up, Ho-Fung, which is the slipping back into scientific metrocentrism and the kind of correlation of positivist empiricism, which are topics we've talked about already quite a bit, with that kind of taking for granted of a kind of a presentist society in which one is working. Homo academicus. Yes, I don't think Bourdieu's treatment of 1968 is by any means the last word on the topic, and I don't think anyone would say that. It's just a very stimulating illustration of how field theory can be put into dynamic action, but that doesn't mean it's empirically adequate. And I think one of the things that we would need to look at is the way in which this colonial moment, I mean, these people who had formed themselves in the colonies and then went on to become students or academics in the 60s, they didn't necessarily repress this from their own consciousness, or especially from it was present in their unconscious. And so if you look at the students in Nanterre University, for example, which is the real social science and humanities campus in Paris in the 60s, they don't protest the Algerian War. They don't protest in the early 60s. But by the time the late 60s rolls along, the Vietnam War becomes the central theme that sparks the student movement at Nanterre. Why the Vietnam War? Well, after all, that was a French colony that was passed on to the US. And the protest against colonialism that they started was very far-reaching compared to some of the other discourses about the Vietnam War. So I think there are a number of careers where we can find this too. The entire anthropology profession, much of the sociology profession, economics, as you point out, with Samir Amin and other figures in developmentalist economics after 1960 and 62, they come out of colonial developmentalism. The main journals like Third World, Tiers Monde, and so on are founded by these people who worked in the colonies. So what I'm kind of saying is 1968 needs to be seen in that light as well in France, as a kind of a delayed after effect. In Germany, you have this great term, the Nachgeholte Revolution, the revolution that we're making up for that we didn't carry out. It was the anti-colonial revolution, in part, one might argue. That would be a kind of a hypothesis I would like to see someone integrate with Bourdieu's notion of field asynchronicity. Social background of students is important. Bourdieu talks about sociology as a kind of a pariah discipline or a denigrated discipline, one that philosophy students sneered at from the École Normale. This is definitely the case. This is definitely very specific to France, although there's an anti-sociology in the British, in the Cambridge and Oxford universities as well, which leads them to finally agree to hire sociology professors who happen to be colonial sociologists, who had been anthropologists at the very beginning when they hired their very first sociologists, because sociology was so downgraded. It was such an outsider, marginal discipline. Now, this certainly must have something to do with the social background of the students in sociology as well. But I didn't look into the data on that. I didn't follow that up. What I did follow up, though, was how sociology had become the most popular discipline in France among graduate students by the early 1960s, and how most of those students actually worked with Ballandier. He was the foremost advisor. He had the most advisees of anyone in the EHESS, the French Higher Institute of Social Studies. And he worked together with Paul Mercier, who was his close collaborator in Senegal after 40. They were the two advisors together with a third person, and Roger Bastide, who'd had Levi-Strauss's chair before Levi-Strauss of graduate students in France in the early 1960s. In other words, sociology students working on Africa were the most common graduate students in social science up until about 1963 or 64. But what was their social background? Probably a little bit different. That would be interesting to look at. In Britain, it's much more clear that there's a kind of a social elitism of anthropology directed explicitly against sociology. And I have the quote from Barrington Kay, who was the British sociologist in Malaya, who actually explicitly said the colonial administrator looks at the sociologist and the anthropologist and sees the sociologist as this finicky, number crunching, low-class, bureaucratic civil servant type guy, where they look at the anthropologist and they see this guy from the elite, from the public schools, from Eton, from Oxford and Cambridge, and they know exactly which one they want to side with, namely the anthropologist. Of course, that was self-serving for some of them, but I think it's an important topic. Yeah.
But we only have 9 minutes left, so I'll ask you to.
Okay.
Yeah,
let's get to some of the other questions. Yeah.
Okay. Are you done with the response?
Well, I would say one word about the Strauss and Weber question, because Ho-Fung did end with that, and that was very important for his comment. So I agree with you on Schmidt. Sorry, not Strauss, Schmidt. And I think there's clear evidence now that the anti-Semitism that only became obvious when his private diaries were published informs the conceptual apparatus of his work. And this is Raphael Gross's book, Carl Schmitt and the Jews, I think demonstrates this very well. Now, of course, nothing is ever proven. It needs to be debated. But as soon as his private comments enter into the very conceptual core of the conceptual apparatus, I think that's a different kind of an issue. And I didn't have time to talk about Nick. Of course, it takes a ton of time. I think this is why we're professional sociologists and we're not amateurs, and we need to kind of keep our eyes on the standards of our discipline. And I think I read everything by Ballandier and Bourdieu. I didn't read every single word by Aron, but almost everything. And it can be done. I mean, this is what scholarship consists of. Intellectual historians, would agree. I mean, Chaz Kamek read everything, every scrap Veblen ever wrote in his book on Veblen. So, we need to insert ourselves in this debate and not let it be taken over by, I don't know, people who don't do this kind of, who are more willing to pass judgment without hearing the entire case put before them. And to keep front of mind that nothing is ever, I mean, this is the critical realist line on science in general. It's a never-ending process. So there is no final answer, obviously. So thanks very much. I'm sorry I didn't get to your other questions, but Nick, I'll send them to you afterwards.
Thank you for this elaborate response. And I just want to take a brief moment to introduce my co-organizers, Yan Long from Berkeley and Yang Zhang from American University. Have been kind of having with the logistics. And Yan Long, because she joined from the West Coast, so she was a little bit late. We have one comment and 3 questions. one comment from Cracker Home from Arizona State. He said, I'm abusing the Q&A to make a comment. The discussion was terrific. The comments were I can't hear you, Ho-Fung. Okay. The comments were well informed and insightful. And how often one can one say this? They are testament to the depth and interest of George's work, the extent to which combining historic sociology with theory, sociological knowledge, and history of the field is itself central to reflexivity. They also encourage new optimism about the present and future of historic sociology. Thank you for that. I want to thank you to Craig for the comment. And 3 questions. First from Si-Ying Fu from Wisconsin-Madison. She said, thank you so much, Professor Steinmetz, for this talk and for writing a great book. I have 3 questions. The first is actually the same as one for Professor Holmes. Did you analyze in any way the students of these colonial sociologists? Because as we know, any scientific discipline is built on and pursues accumulation, expansion of knowledge. How are their thoughts and theories inherited, extended, or challenged by the students, in particular by younger generation of sociologists of colonialism in general? And that, I think, may reflect the evolution of colonial concepts and theories over time. My second and third questions are related. You mentioned early on in your presentation that sociology of knowledge should take text seriously and really collaborate with other disciplines for or make use of their analytical tools such as formal textual analysis. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about this, that, and how can you suggest sociologists, especially historic sociologists, do that? What are some of the potential dangers of doing that, and how may we avoid those dangers? Related to that, I actually just read your 2007 piece on the relationship between American sociology and history, in which you mentioned that a historical awareness can help sociologists avoid reification of theoretical concepts. Don't you worry that formal textual analysis runs the risk of just that? If so, how may those of us who want to utilize those answers, newer, fancier methods, be careful about minimizing that risk? Thank you. The second question from Guobing Yang from University of Pennsylvania. Thanks so much for sharing your book and insights, George. My question is related to Nicholas' last points about reflexivity. Did the French sociologists in your study, in their encounters with anti-colonial struggle, gain any understanding of intellectual practice that may go beyond reflexivity? There seems to be an assumption in the sociological literature that through reflexivity, the sociologist can attain the status of knower, the authority of knowledge, the enlightened enlighter. But can they ever, should they ever even aspire to that in the first place? And then from Nicholas Silver, what does the entanglement between empire and society explored in the book do to illuminate the evolution of the distinction in society between experts and scientists? I guess it speaks to the multi-layered issues of autonomy and heteronomy. The last question from Jack Gary Lee. One question that emerged in this discussion of this active amnesia of the colonial background of sociologist emergence is the significance of anti-colonial nationalism, making a shift in the imagination of society, and the ways the practice of developmentalism shifts away from the colonial administrative apparatus to UN, League of Nations, and their varied agents. Does this shift in the international context affect social thought? Wow, you only have 1 minute to. I
only have 1 minute. Okay, and I had to read that. For some reason, I couldn't hear you. Can you all hear me? Okay, good. Yeah. So I mean, maybe Jack's point is the easiest one to do in 1 minute. I did try to do justice to the international context as well. And there's a brief discussion of like UNESCO and American foundations. And one of the fascinating things is how UNESCO was so French dominated in its social science outfit, or European dominated and less Americanizing. And the American foundations like Rockefeller that really wanted, they literally used the language of beachheads within European sociology at this time, how they failed in France rather miserably, except among those, rather famous in the demography section like Stutzel and so on. But among these more generative sociologists, they had very little impact. I agree, after 1960, after decolonization, when developmentalist sets in, this all shifts, and eventually the social science section of UNESCO is eliminated. But during this period, it worked kind of hand in glove with colonial sociology of the sort that I'm describing here. It sponsored important conferences, one gigantic one in Africa, where many of the figures, both from the British, but also the Spanish, Portuguese, and French and South African social scientific worlds came together. I just couldn't do justice to that in my comments here today.
Thank you. Does that conclude our discussion today? Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, thank you all for, I think, yeah.
Yeah, because people are willing to stay a little bit longer. Since there are also questions for others, do you want to give everybody a little bit of time?
Maybe 50 minutes.
I mean, I would leave this to the panelists to decide.
I think I can put off lunch for 10, 15 more minutes.
Thank you very much for that.
Actually, can I jump in here and address one of the, I'd really like to hear what George has to say about the formal and computational sort of text analysis question, because I think that this is probably a question that many a budding historical social scientist has. I myself have been a little curious in this area. And so I'm curious what your take is on this, George.
Okay, so one of the things that this goes back to your question about psychoanalysis, which I wasn't able to answer. And one of the differences between the way you framed it and the way I would frame it is that even sort of my colleagues in psychology who do, neuropsychology and kind of brain analysis have now demonstrated the existence of unconscious emotions. So the unconscious is no longer off limits to any psychologist. Unfortunately, they evicted psychoanalysis from American psychology departments many years ago. Michigan was one of the last psych departments with a full-fledged psychoanalytic grouping, which I think was kicked out about 10 years ago. So American, psychology, as you well know, has always been much more allergic to this. Whereas one of the reasons this is so intrinsic to my book is that these French sociologists were located in a world in which psychoanalysis was a very prominent field, and it still is in French bookstores. You go in, there's entire psychoanalysis tables. Lacan wasn't as influential as Levi-Strauss for a brief period of time, a little bit later than Levi-Strauss. And Bourdieu's vocabulary is almost doubled, almost in the way he says he saw the colonial situation as a doubling, requiring a Gestalt switch even to see. His own texts require, if you read them psychoanalytically, a Gestalt switch, because you can read them through psychoanalysis, as many psychoanalytically informed people have done, and see that many of his concepts can be replaced by psychoanalytic ones. And he even admitted that this was the case. He said, I would have needed another lifetime to, I think, to Louis Vaconte, he said this to master all of this, but he was so immersed in it that his concepts are repression, disavowal, unconscious, and so on are crucial to his work. Now, the beginning of, so I think cognitive psychology has more trouble with these kinds of issues. And I think the reading techniques, for example, looking for close resonances between a word, but it might not be the same word in a text by Ballaudier and his mentor Léris to figure out why he's saying something, cannot be done with computational analysis. There's just no way. It's not through word proximity. It's not through anything. It's not through repetition of words. It may be a single ending of a word that changes your analysis. It's definitely the narrative structure, which, you know, people have tried to quantify narrative, and it always reduces it to something that's not narrative. It becomes mere word sequence. And that's not what narrative is about. It's a structure based on other structures of telling stories that we have in our minds in given cultures. And these books all have a narrative structure as well. Vallandier's first book, as I say, ends with this phrase. It's a phrase. He says, "I am now going to become a sociologist of Black Africa," after an entire autobiography that goes through his early childhood, his fantasies about being a colonizer, his brief flirtation with Vichy, his turn against Vichy, his joining the resistance. I mean, it's an incredibly up and down narrative. And then finally, he sees a little notice on the wall that says, "Fellowships available if you'll go to Africa, we'll pay for you." And he says, "I jump on that. I'm now launching myself on a new autobiography." That kind of structure can't be dealt with with a quantitative narratological framework, because you have to see it against all the other existentialist treatments of self-launching at the time. You have to be aware of Rousseauian confessional autobiography. You have to know which of these to select. You have to plug them in. I suppose you could plug in Rousseau and Sartre and maybe the dominant narratological frameworks of the time and get something out of that. But that would take a lot more effort than just reading the two damn books and thinking about them. So why bother is what I would say. Now, there's something that's a little disingenuous, because I do say I conduct a prosopography. And I did, for the field analysis, need to do something akin to what you're talking about. It's a kind of a big data analysis of a miniature field of a couple hundred people at most. But that I think is useful. And I think somebody might be able to find something useful by even doing a quantitative analysis of social background, as Ho-Fung brought up, and seeing how that correlates with these people's work. That, there are many things that correspondence analysis or network analysis, or both of them, because they're not the same thing, might discover in this. Does that help?
Yeah, we have a question, two questions, very short question from Julian Go, and we are asking him to join us on the podium panel to ask the question probably directly.
Okay.
Julian, are you there, or do you would prefer me to read the questions?
No, I'm here. It's okay. Hi.
Okay.
Great session.
Okay, once again, for some reason I can't hear you, but I can read you.
Can you hear me now? George, can you hear me now?
I can see your text being transcribed, but I don't know why my speakers aren't working.
Okay, well, I kind of was just asking for you to go back to, I guess, the spirit of Nick's question about comparison with the other arguments about sociology made by Connell and the earlier sociologists. And the way I think about that question is that, I mean, you're making an argument that studying the colonies in the period you're looking at was actually made for a fruitful sociology, whereas I think you would agree that Connell's argument is that studying the colonies by the earlier sociologists was actually a terrible sociology. So what's the difference? And it sounds like you're making an argument about the social conditions in the colonies. So you're kind of making to put it crudely, a materialist claim about the social conditions produce certain types of sociologies. I don't know if you could just clarify what's the difference essentially between the earliest sort of Orientalist sociologists who really had a poor understanding of colonial peoples versus the sociologists you're talking about. And I would wonder if you might want to ponder that maybe their work with local sociologists like Abdel Malik Said or local thinkers was actually what made it different.
Thanks. I was able to read your entire comment, so it worked. So the argument is not that social context is the only factor. It's a congeries of factors that the book goes through kind of systematically. So the first factor are these broad social epochal contexts. which differed in the post-war period dramatically from the era of high imperialism, or even from the interwar period, where indirect rule was dominant in the British and even in the French African colonies, and led to a kind of a prioritization of an anthropology that sought older traditions and to reinstantiate them, if possible, through colonial rule in many cases, even if it was, of course, a distorted version of that. But that there's also the context of intellectual contexts, and those are both the intellectual contexts of disciplines bordering the one in question. Sociology barely existed as an autonomous discipline before post-World War II. So it's very immersed. Durkheimianism becomes the dominant theory of British social anthropology, for example, and that's why they call themselves sociologists. A lot of the time when people call themselves sociologists, we have to interrogate what they really mean by that. And then the context of the individual actors' training in the university. For Bourdieu, it was key, and for Aron, it was key that they were trained in this Bachelardian philosophy of science, which gave them already a break with the positivist traditions, and especially with the racist traditions of Gobineau. I mean, they would never have even allowed his book into the library. I mean, are you kidding? So the intellectual training was completely different. And then the biographical interaction, and that's the second part of your question, with the conditions on the ground, as I point out, was very important for Ballandier, for example. Ballandier, coming from this marginal, and not to say just marginal, but militant resistance background in the occupation, immediately associated himself with Alioune Diop, as I discussed, who's the founder of Présence Africaine, and he even stayed with Diop and his wife when he was in Senegal, earning the disdain from the colonial officials in Dakar. And then he moved to Guinea, where he also created a new journal with one of the African social scientists who was already there, hired by IFAM, the French Black Africa. In Bourdieu's case, the interaction with Sayad, as Amin Perez's book details, was really important to him. But I don't think we can ignore all of the other factors, and I think they all have to be brought together. These American sociologists and these British ones who wrote about imperialism, at least most of them, especially the Americans, didn't have this philosophical background. They already had an imagination of sociology as a kind of a natural scientific field. They grew out of economics in most departments instead of out of anthropology or other joint departments or philosophy or other interdisciplinary mixes. So it's the American context per se that's quite different to start out with. I think if you look at even the British debate, and you know this as well as I do, you know this better than I do, my sense is that, the stuff that was going on in the pre-World War I British sociology with Hobson and Hobhouse and even H.G. Wells was a genuine anti-colonialism. It was an anti-imperialist kind of proto-sociology that was different even from the American one, because Hobhouse was trained as a kind of was a philosopher, and Westermarck came out of anthropology. So the constellation in US sociology was different. I think Connell also extended his argument to French and British at the time. But I think even for that early period, I would want more kind of nuance on the different people. I don't think they would turn out to be the same. And I think even in the British post-war colonial sociology, it looks different from those guys. And I haven't written that, I'm still writing that book, but I mean, because all of them are deeply immersed in social anthropology, and many of them are trained in anthropology and then move in under the influence of Max Gluckman, under the power of Max Gluckman, are put into sociology jobs. They have a social anthropology background, which ultimately means it's a kind of a Durkheimianism. So there's a kind of a interesting way in which even the early British sociology of colonialism is completely different from anything that happened in the United States. And the US still has a lot of disadvantages, I think, intellectually. I'm not saying there's not fantastic pragmatism and other intellectual traditions, but the pragmatism didn't really intersect with colonial sociology as far as I can see. The African-American students of Park Some of them did excellent empirical work, I think, on colonialism. And I think the empiricism of American sociology served St. Clair Drake in Ghana and Franklin Fraser, especially when Fraser became the head of UNESCO's social science division. I mean, this is an amazing moment. He's the one who sponsors the conference in Equatorial Africa, where all the greatest figures of this period come together. So that's the one tradition that lives on, even in the interwar period, that I think is really interesting in American sociology of colonialism. And then you have to wait quite a few years, although you get the kind of Marxist anti-imperialist sociology in the 60s, some of the stuff that Ho-Fung talked about. You know, obviously there's some of that in American sociology and Latin American sociology, which leads to a discussion of imperialism. But all of these themes that we've been talking about aren't present in that. There's no field work, close field work. There's very little genuine historical research of the sort that Berck or Eric de Dampierre or others did. There's not even a concept of historical sociology that's related to that. Whereas, you know, our own, coming from his training in Weimar, Germany, introjects this idea of historical sociology into French sociology. And then the Annales creates a historiography that's very open to people like Berck, because they're doing work in North Africa. And that creates a new kind of historical sociology before it even had a name in French sociology, before Bourdieu came along and created his version of that. So by the end of Bourdieu's turn to history in the 70s, you have a legacy of the Annales, you have a legacy of Aronian Weimar historical sociology, and strands of that, because, you know, the journal, European Journal of Sociology, is created in that spirit, and it still exists. The journal is, Aron said, supposed to recall the name of Max Weber's journal. The Archiv Européen de Sociologie is supposed to recall Weber's Archiv der Sozialwissenschaften. That's why he named it that. So you have a historical sociology a la Aron, a sociology a la Bourdieu, with the kind that we talked about with the Parisian analysis, for example, of May 68, or his interactions with Christophe Charles and others. And then you have the kind of historical sociology of Ballaudier's dynamic sociology, which leads his students into the archives, even in the early 60s. So I don't know, maybe I'm just, you know, you always get taken by whatever object you're working on as an intellectual historian. And there's a danger of being kidnapped by the people you work on. And to some extent, I've obviously been kidnapped by them intellectually. But I hope that I've shown that there's still some reason to encourage other people to go back and read them, and hopefully to get some of this work, for example, by Jacques Berck, translated into English.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I mean,
Thank you.
Berck's book on decolonization from the early 60s is one of the most brilliant books on decolonization that I've ever read, and it's called The Dispossession of the World, and it still doesn't exist in English. So,
Thank you.
but are we staying
Yeah.
for 50 more minutes? Is that really
Yeah,
what you mean,
well,
or is
we
it
have
until
exceeded
1
that.
o'clock?
We have exceeded that 15 minutes. So thank you
15, okay.
to everyone for your
So
comment
about
and
there, I think.
tuning, and thank George for sharing the book. But yeah, it's thank you.
Thank all of you.
you.
Thanks to
Thank
all
you,
of you for
everyone.
this.
Rest of the summer.
Thank you.
It's very interesting.